My name is Angelo ESTRELLA-FARIA. I'm a principal legal officer with the Secretariat of UNCITRAL, and we have today a panel of 3 high-level experts that will address implementing tools that enable next level PPPs. I will introduce the 3 of them before we start. Each expert would have about 5 to 7 minutes for her or his presentations. I will go first. I will be followed by Shaina Salman, who's a senior legal counsel of the African Legal Support Facility at Ivory Coast. She's a legal counsel at the African Legal Support Facility. She's been with the facility since December 2017 and worked in the project team primarily on PPPs and sovereign debt projects. The following speaker will be Fred EINBINDER, who's an attorney at law and a professor and consultant with more than 28 years of experience as in-house counsel for major French infrastructure companies, including SPI, Vinci, and Alstom. And last but not least, the final speaker in our panel will be Marc Frilet. Marc is the managing partner of the law firm of Frilet, Société d'Avocats. He has been involved in major construction infrastructure project division. His practice of over 35 years focusing on concessions, PPPs, mining projects, and he has been also involved in international standard setting, mainly within the ambit of the Economic Commission for Europe of the United Nations. So as you see, we have a very high-level panel, and it is my privilege to moderate their discussion. We will start with a brief presentation on the UNCITRAL instruments on PPPs. If you could begin sharing my screen now, please. Very briefly, just to introduce this international standard. UNCITRAL, the UN Commission on International Trade Law, has adopted in 2001 a guide on legislative guide and legislative recommendations for poverty finance infrastructure projects. That document, next slide please, was updated in 2019. And here you see the 2019 edition of the legislative guide. It is now called Legislative Guide on Public Private Partnerships. This not only expanded the scope of the original guide, but also took into account major developments since the adoption of the guide in 2001. Next, please. Those new standards included not only the Sustainable Development Goals that had been adopted after the first edition of the UNCITRAL Guide, but also the UN Convention Against Corruption in 2003, and international tools such as the Public Investment Management Assessment put in place by the IMF. The general guiding principles of PPPs, as you all know, are public interest, project management and accountability, and also economy and efficiency. Next, please. Now, the newly revised guide by UNCITRAL, which has been recommended to states for use by the UN General Assembly, has a new chapter focusing on project planning and preparation, and we'll be hearing a lot about this in the course of this discussion. Why is this such an important point? Because practice of international institutions, mainly the World Bank Group, has identified poor planning as one of the most significant obstacles to successful PPP implementation. Poor planning of PPPs leads to increasing costs for the public authority over the project cycle, and poor planning also fails to take into account the needs of the public at the stage of conception of the project. Also, the planning stage is essential in order for the public authorities to be sure that a PPP is really the best alternative that would offer best value for money as compared to direct public procurement. Next, please. We see the legal framework for PPPs includes a variety of sources coming all the way down from the Constitution to the scope of authority to award contracts set forth in legislation and the institutional mechanism, mainly of a PPP unit. And a key element in this is obviously the selection of the private partner. And this is the single largest chapter in the UNCITRAL legislative guide and model legislative provisions. Next, please. One central element also of the UNCITRAL legislative guide and model legislative provisions, and one essential point of updating the guide was the issue related to balancing the interests of the public and the private sector, especially then during the period of contract management, but also stressing the need for the public authority and a PPP unit to take into account possible need for adaptation of the contract that may arise later on and factor that in the planning stage of the project. We have here basically to build a bridge between a contracting authority that would be exercising implied powers on legislation and would have a natural interest in ensuring the continuity of service, and we have a certain number of implied or mandatory contractual terms that would be construed into the contract, with a private partner that would be concerned about construction operation costs, keeping the continuity of cash flow and continuity of operations, and how these two apparently conflicting interests can be harmonized in a system that ensures a proper contract management, but also some flexibility for contract adaptation during the life of the contract. So the guide invites a review of the legislative framework to make sure that there are built-in mechanisms for ensuring how to deal with changing circumstances, to preserve contractual obligation in case of performance disruption, and to ensure long-term contract stability. Next slide, please. That I was simply setting the stage for our colleagues who will be discussing, stressing that the vision and the recommendations formulated by UNCITRAL in this legislative guide to stress the importance of the planning stage for the purpose of proper contract management, for the purpose of balancing the interests of both parties, but also to ensure that a project is well conceived from the point of view of public sector, and avoid a situation where once a private partner is on board and has, so to speak, a monopoly on the provision of that service, that no undue pressure will be exerted on the public sector for ex post amendments and adaptations to the contract. So the legislative recommendations in the new legislative guide also set parameters for possible future adaptations of the contract to make sure that at the end, the contract is not afterwards altered to the extent that would be contrary to the very basis for awarding that contract to that company in the first place. So with that, I think I have offered enough food for thought for the speakers that would follow me, and it's now my privilege to give the floor to Shaina. Shaina, have the floor, please.
These legal advisors also provide capacity building through training sessions to governments and local legal counsel. So my remarks will focus on three areas. First, the snapshot of the status quo as we know it of PPPs in Africa, a very quick snapshot. The challenges for PPPs on the continent, and 3 key tools that, if implemented, will allow governments, not just African governments, but all PPP units facing similar challenges, to have more people-first, bankable PPPs. So in the last 15 years, around 40 African countries have adopted PPP laws, and several of them have also adopted PPP policies, which leaves less than 10 African countries entirely without a PPP framework. And that's according to our pre-2017 data. And the good promotion of PPP frameworks in Africa was based on an initial consensus on the benefit of a good PPP legal framework, which not only serves to identify successful projects, but also guide those projects effectively and transparently towards closure, all the while ensuring sustainable development goals are met and investors are getting a return. But the reality still remains that those laws and policies have not yet led to an increase in pipelines of sustainable PPP projects in line with those sustainable development goals. And the critics are just mounting against PPPs. And so among the PPP projects in Africa, it appears very few of them are governed by corresponding PPP law. And this does not mean that these laws have no merit. It means, though, that they fail perhaps to address in an inclusive manner several red flags, issues common to most projects in Africa, which are preventing PPP development. And as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has not helped the situation. We may not know how many countries have actually been impacted, or if more countries have actually increased their PPPs in the last few years. However, we do know that COVID-19 had a rather large impact on private investment commitments. According to the World Bank Private Participation in Infrastructure database, for example, in 2020, global private investment commitments stood at $21.9 billion US. That's across 128 projects globally, which represents a decline of 56%. So what we can logically link that to is a possible decline in PPP projects, which often is the case when it comes to lower private investment commitments. And so what are the challenges that are keeping more PPPs from being developed and given that we have the laws and we have the policies in place and we have so many tools and so many things at our disposal? So I sum it up to just about 3 points. And it's interesting because the UNCITRAL updated guides do point to this as well. So PPP frameworks are not translating to bankable projects because they're dull. They don't reflect the realities of the field. They still often don't consider things like people-first PPPs or model changes that we've seen in the last few years. Ripe candidate projects for PPPs are being considered under other schemes of law, and that's because of a lack of project preparation, which Angelo spoke about in the introduction. A lack of intergovernmental cooperation, which requires proper project preparation at the outset. PPPs are failing not because, PPPs are failing because post-contractual obligations are not clear. And again, that may be because of a lack of intergovernmental collaboration. Because, for example, you need the Ministry of Finance involved for all that's related to signing on to contingent liabilities. You need the Port Authority involved for a port. You need the PPP unit and sometimes the Attorney General's office. And if everyone's not on the same page, this leads to failed projects and failed future projects, honestly. So what are those tools that can be implemented to lead to next level PPPs? First, reinvigorating PPP frameworks. Yes, the PPP frameworks are there, but do they reflect project realities? Governments must periodically review and propose changes. And we know that this is difficult, but it just has to be done. Look at your frameworks. Ask, does it reflect people-first PPPs? And one way to do this is to look at the UNCITRAL PPP legal guide and model legislative provisions as a jumping point to redesign or amend your frameworks. The guide provides clear clauses in line with best international practices. People first PPPs, value for people PPPs have been recently addressed as part of the UNICE PPP International Center of Excellence programs. And they've had key publications with standard practices and templates, all endorsed by UNICE member states. So the aggregate of this innovative set of interrelated documents or publications need to be, and at least deserve to be, seriously considered for integration into countries' legal and institutional enabling environment for PPPs. In Africa and around the world, this is what really is going to bring those PPP projects to the next level. Also, next level project planning and preparation. Design your projects with value for people in mind. And value for people is just an improved version of value for money, with the end objective being higher quality services for the public. Integrate value for people into your project planning phase, which is the key phase of PPP projects, keeping in mind those sustainable development goals. Promote intergovernmental collaboration and cooperation, all with the sustainable development goals in mind, and meet regularly with stakeholders to ensure better project preparation. And finally, the last tool is having clear post-contractual management plans. Plan ahead. Pull out your obligations from these agreements. Ask yourself the questions. Do you know what the government is signing up for? A clear post-contractual management plan answers the question who, what, when, and how. Who will be responsible for what payments, when, and how often, for example. Clear post-contractual management plans are reassuring for everyone. Investors are reassured, government is reassured, and that's what will lead to next level PPP projects in the future. So in conclusion, while the status quo may appear grim for PPPs, the future is actually brighter than ever if we're willing to shift the way we think about PPPs and put people first. We're seeing challenges in Africa with regard to PPPs, and likely similar challenges across the world. That's PPP frameworks not translating into projects, PPP frameworks not being used, other projects being done under other sectorial laws, or inefficient or insufficient, and sometimes non-existent post-contractual management plans. And so I think these tools can really allow PPP units to level up their projects, reinvigorating the PPP frameworks, as I mentioned, so that they reflect the reality. Next level project planning that accounts for people first and promotes intergovernmental collaboration, and post-contractual management plans that are clear and serve to reassure all parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaina. Thank you very much. And now, Fred.
Well, thank you, Angelo, and good afternoon. Very useful work in the PPP field has been completed, and notably the UNCITRAL legal guide and provisions as summarized by Angelo. We need, as Shaina pointed out, to go further to the next level. And UNCITRAL, of course, is doing that. They keep on updating. I believe the last one was 2019. We at UNC, the Center of Excellence, which is led by Marc, who will speak after me, have also been active in this regard. What is remarkable is how complementary the work is among these institutions. And just listening to Shaina, it's just remarkable how whatever I say is exactly what has been my personal experience and hers, and how we need to learn from them to go further. Too many PPPs, not only in Africa, still flounder, and we need to reduce failures by going to the next step. To this end, I mentioned very useful UNC documents that have been improved by governments throughout the world, publications. There's 4 of them, just mention them. Zero tolerance approach to corruption. 2, PPP project planning and prioritization. I can't emphasize the need to prioritize too much. 3rd, how one involves reliable and independent experts in low and middle income countries in the process. And last but not least, a list of contract clauses and guiding principles, which Marc Frilet will discuss. If I might, I'd like to suggest to you that you should think of these around 3 themes that are used often by Angelo and by many, many people. Maybe the terminology is a bit different, and they're critical in understanding and how one implements, and they interact dynamically. And I would say the three are, first, the word purpose. And when we use the word purpose, we always have to remember it's a public purpose. Well, that might seem obvious, but it often is forgotten. Secondly, it's a partnership. So you have the private party. They have to be, and governments have to work as a partnership. Easy to say, not always easy to do. Second, the notion of achieving a balance between what may be conflicting imperatives, and the UNC and UNCITRAL and other bodies' documents try to achieve that balance. Third, word hasn't come up exactly, but the need for experience. And that relates to a number of issues, but particularly expertise. Let me just demonstrate very briefly. Corruption. We know we have to stop that. What is the zero tolerance guide? Just to give an example. Well, besides talking about corruption, we focus on conflicts of interest, which is a hard thing in practice to deal with. Example, many of you are in PPP units. You need, and there's a recommendation, of course, it's common sense, to separate those who prepare the PPP documents from anybody who supervises, audits the decision-making. Well, no one, I think, is going to disagree too much of that. It's not always so easy to implement, but that's a key principle. Also, what is seen, and there's been studies about this in the anti-corruption field, particularly with conflicts of interest, a balance has to be achieved between detail and not so much detail. And you have to find the right balance, and that's what these works that we put out try to do. Not always so easy. If you're too detailed, studies showed, on conflicts of interest, you tend to create opportunities for corruption. If you don't give any guidance on what to do, you reinforce those possibilities. So achieving that balance. Second, on prioritization. In my own experience as working for an entrepreneur for construction infrastructure companies all over the world and in PPPs, it is essential. And Shaina points about post-contractual. You are not going to succeed with post-contract. Can you still hear me? Because post-contractual, if the parties don't sit down and take time to articulate what are they doing. And we see that's in Article 5 of UNICE's list of contracts, and also, of course, in UNCITRAL. It just seems obvious. We all know we're building a port. It's not obvious. There are social purposes. There's going to be economic development. Go through the genesis of the project. Discuss it. Fight about it. That's the way you learn about the other party. Don't rush. Spend time on Article 5. I can assure you people don't. And it prevents those disciplines. It's not just the government, it's engineers, lawyers, civil servants, political parties. They need to work together. That is easier said than done. And you don't want any one party taking too much precedence, okay? If it's all engineers, you're never going to come up with a project. They'll just be designing it forever. If it's all lawyers, you'll have wonderful contracts after everybody screams at each other, but you'll never get a project, so forth. You have to work together, easier said than done. And one way to focalize that is have a discussion on purpose. Do not rush into things. Plan, but don't think the negotiations can be done in a second. Even if they can, don't do that. Learn about the other parties. That's easier said than done because there's always pressures. 2 points that I've seen: avoid, and it's hard, conclusory negotiating principles from finance. I hope this no longer is true, but it used to drive me crazy. everything was stopped because the bankers would say, it's market, it's market. So we were simply to accept that it's just nonsense. Or constantly, all over the world, here in France, certainly, everyone agrees, and then at the beginning, middle, or post-contractual, somebody says, the Minister of Finance won't do it. You have to ensure that they're, as Shaina said, involved at the beginning, so they just can't block it, because that's what they always tend to do anywhere in the world. Third, experience and balance, and this goes throughout everything, but particularly to the choice of experts. It is not a good idea to simply look at cost. There are too many experts who have very little experience who will come up with a ridiculously low cost. Reject it. Just reject it. You can't accept that. In private companies, for things nothing to do with PPP, we had people with big projects and would get a wonderful cost. We'd say, no, we're not taking it. It's obviously too low. You have to look at who knows what they're doing, and most importantly, who is going to stay for the long term. These are long-term projects. Inevitably, there tends to be delay. Get experts who are in for the long haul. They could be from big companies, they could be from small companies, but they need to be passionate, experienced, and practically you have a whole section on how you set up, how they should submit their CVs. That's very, very important. Achieving the balance. As local PPP units, avoid being overtaken by expertise. That's easy to fall into that trap. They know a lot, and sometimes they like to go on about that. You have to infuse the project with local concerns, as Shaina said. On the other hand, you can't hire people just for the sake of hiring them and do things the way you want to do it locally. Then why have experts? You need, and I think everyone recognized, there is a great scope for expertise. Take it, but lead on certain things, and don't let any one expert take over the project by saying this is the way we've always done it everywhere. That's useful, but you always need to adapt it, and that's the process of negotiating and taking time to learn. Last but not least, contract clause. I've mentioned Article 5, the purpose. Marc, we'll talk about Angelo. There's plenty to read on it. Spend time negotiating. It's never lost time. That's how you get to know the other party. And you can raise your voice from time to time. And since I'm in France, I hope it's not always illegal, but you'd have to look at that. Maybe having a meal together sometimes is not such a bad idea. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. I think that was a perfect move to what Marc is going to be sharing with us. Marc, the floor is yours.
Yes. Oh, well, thanks a lot. So everything which was said earlier, of course, is extremely important. And it's fully true that there are very few chances to develop a good PPP around the world, and especially in the low and middle income countries, unless those principles, those good advices are implemented on the ground. But there is a stage where we need to consider how to implement this in a sustainable and useful manner. And we arrive to the question of what to put in a contract. No one should forget that at the end of the journey, to a set of contractual obligations which need to take into account many particular issues which are specific to PPP. Some of them which are very different or even unknown in a traditional contract. For instance, how many of us realize that a real partnership contract must integrate also some feature of company law, for instance, in a decision-making process during the lifetime of the project. It means that we have to consider how to propose a set of contractual clauses which could be valid in most situations based on common issues. If what we have been doing at the level of a specialized center of excellence of UNICE, we have developed a full program trying to identify and to aggregate best international contractual practices for concession PPP, users fee PPP, meeting the SDGs in the core infrastructure public sectors. There has been a long program, and the result of that is a list of clauses and guiding principles which have been published and endorsed as recommendation by UNICE member states. In a few minutes, I will present to you this list of inclusive balance clauses and outline their content in relation to 3 points, which are very often considered as a non-starter in the planning and development of PPP under the concession users fee PPP delivery form. And this is a problem because this delivery form is often the only delivery form which can be seriously envisaged by a country, by a public authority, due to budgetary constraints. I just show you briefly the 50 articles of this document. Of course, we'll not. I have no time to make any comment on all of them, but you will find in a document that is displayed in yellow the key articles which will underpin what I am about to talk with you. So I will very simply in this to address 3 challenges: how to reconcile public and private interests, and this is something that I have to consider very seriously each time you develop a project. PPP need to meet several objectives which are prima facie in conflict. The situation is very complex because public interest and private interest have different definition and objective. For instance, for the private interest, for the lenders, they want to guarantee to be reimbursed within a given time period. What about the PPP contractor, operator, or SPV? You know that he has a duty to satisfy the end users during the whole project life cycle. He has to provide water in good condition for the people. He has to provide power. He has to set a highway, a port, etc., which always satisfy the end users. That is an issue of potential conflict in private interest. In relation to public interest, then also the contracting authorities and states also have a dilemma. To start with, they want to stick with the 4 corners of the contract. They have negotiated fiercely with lenders, which really don't want to have any changes anywhere. But at the same time, they do recognize that they need to adapt the contract to potentially changing interests of the end user of the service during the project life cycle. Never forget that a contracting authority or a state is not the real contractor of the PPP project. They do that for the benefit of the people, and they are accountable to the people. So that's another dilemma. What is the proposed solution in the document that I show briefly to you? First of all, Article 20, public service and related public interest come first, which is essentially the people first concept from UNICE. What is the consequence? The consequence is the right for the contracting authority to impose changes to the private party obligations. Of course, this needs to be justified. Now, this creates a problem if there's unilateral changes. So then, of course, you need to have a balancing set of clauses. When the changes in the private party obligation is justified by public interest, and when this is detrimental to the private partner interest beyond a certain threshold, then the contract must provide for a set of direct or indirect compensation mechanisms to restore what is referred to and what is essential for both parties, the contract economic equilibrium. Now, challenge 2, how to restore contract economic equilibrium through acceptable contractual mechanism without contractual negotiation. Then this template contract, which has been endorsed by the UNC member state, propose a web of 4 concepts, which are very traditional when you are dealing with a matter around the world. First of all, party agrees based essentially on the project financial and economic business case. This is the core of the agreement at the origin, and that should always remain a contractual reference. It should display a fair return and agreed economic and financial viability parameter. Then another set of articles, right for original profit as long as the private partner is not in default. This is another essential feature of sustainable PPP. Bankruptcy of the private partner is never a serious option for the end users. The operation of financial infrastructure service cannot be stopped. The show must go on. So the right to general profit, if the partner is not in default, is essential. Third, Article 24, full transparency in PPP accounting and reporting. This permits to update on a regular basis the financial and economic business case. And 4, Article 43, regular partnership meetings. During those meetings, open to all stakeholders in a well-structured manner. The main objective is to monitor in a friendly atmosphere the progress of the project from all angles, with people first interest at the forefront. This is the cradle for adapting the contract obligation, often with simple trade-off. Then what is important to understand is that those mechanics will also apply to any unforeseen situation or external risks, such as major changes in the economic landscape, force majeure, natural catastrophe, or situation like COVID. So all that to permit to regulate the contract without having the need to have to renegotiate the contract. Last but not least, challenge, early termination of PPP in absence of default. Should that be possible or not? The answer is essentially yes, and you will find several clauses along the line in the document. This is possible, but only for public interest reason duly justified. Always, always people first, people first, people first. Under which conditions? Then you have several articles. Fair system of compensation and indemnification. 1, indemnification for the value of non-amortized assets in good operating condition. 2, indemnification for various justified costs related to termination. 3, indemnification for a share of the loss of anticipated profit. And it's very easy to arrive to a simple calculation of this compensation if you are going back to the original economic and financial scenario, updated for instance, each quarter within the partnership meeting. Conclusion, our center will be most happy to exchange further on the benefit and drawback of those template contract conditions designed for all concession users-free PPP projects in a core infrastructure service sector. One of the objectives is to include this template in a tender document, and we're most happy to have the input of PPP unit in this. What we are hoping is that this template, which aggregates international best practices, could simplify a lot negotiation of PPP development costs and foster the development of pipelines of next level PPP without really affecting the freedom of contract. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc, Fred, and Shaina, for these 3 very rich and informative presentations. We've covered a lot of ground, and I would expect that there will be lots of questions that will be triggered by them. We don't have too much time for questions, but we should be able. I should be able to take up 1 or 2 that are asked by the audience, and those who want to ask questions, please feel free to do so. I have here one question from Mr. Norman Castro. I don't have the complete affiliation. Yes, from the Philippines. Who would like to have a go on that one? Maybe quickly, Shaina and Fred, very quickly. Shaina?
In the circular economy, meaning infrastructure does have a role to play in ensuring, infrastructure professionals have a role to play in ensuring that we are monitoring a circular economy or modeling a circular economy. What does that mean? It means trying to integrate wherever possible recyclables, integrating recycled materials, reducing waste, and all of these things are going towards the environment, but also overall tend to reduce costs. So I know I'm stepping outside of the lines a little bit, but I hope I've given Mr. Castro something to ponder. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps Fred could pick up the next question that was asked, and that is, what best practice would you recommend for fragile states like South Sudan or Congo? It's a very broad question. But
yeah, I don't know if I have an answer. Got very serious problems. The only answer that I would have is you need to do more of what's recommended for other countries. I don't know, when you have conflict in a country, obviously that doesn't make it very easy to do anything, any project, let alone a PPP. This goes to the long term. One good thing in a negative situation is eventually things settle. Eventually. So if you can find parties who are willing to really go the long haul and understand that there's going to be challenges that they understand, but there might be disruption, suspension, that's what you need to do. One more practical recommendation that goes to what Angelo has done at UNCITRAL and Marc as well, and at his comment, you need to be precise but flexible, and particularly flexible in but have contract provisions that deal with how one modifies, because I don't know if force majeure is exactly the right term, but yeah, it might be. How do you keep the project there if something disrupts it? And that is a practical way to do it. What you don't want to do is simply deny that there's a big risk for problem. Go in with your eyes open, and you can't write out everything that's going to happen, but have adjustments, ways of financing if there's suspensions and disruptions, and go from there. So there is a practical thing to do on the contract side.
thank you very much.
I may add a
thank
point.
you very much, Fred.
I may just add a point here on this. May I?
Yeah, but very briefly, because we're running out of
very simply,
2 minutes.
Very simply, Angelo. In fragile states, what is essential is to look at the investment and business climate. And in a large contract, one solution often is, in relation to this investment and business climate, is to propose to the authority and to the parliament to have a special law improving business and investment climate for PPP.
Thank you very much, Marc. There are 2 questions left, and I would very briefly answer both of them, because one of them is addressed directly to UNCITRAL, and the second is more general. I'll begin with the second, talking about, there's a question about whether there is any standardization going on in this area in terms of, I assume in terms of contract legislation best practices. We at UNCITRAL never advocated one single model law. We developed model legislative provisions because we don't believe that one size fits all in this. Each country and each sector are different, And what we propose are provisions that would have to be adapted to the specific context. That said, the World Bank has done also through PF an extensive work of compiling contracts, compiling legislation, and that by itself does lead to some degree of standardization in the sector. But one specific question that was asked was concerning project flexibility. The question was, I hope the UNCITRAL guide has project flexibility covered, and I appreciate if you can tell us to what extent the contracts can be relooked. Well, this is something that was extensively discussed in the UNCITRAL legislative guide. There was a very specific model legislative provision exactly on contract adaptation. It's model provision 45. This provision was amended in the last revision in 2019 to more clearly set out the framework within which you can exercise this. Because you don't want to give an open-ended mandate to the contracting authority to simply accept whatever amendment needs that or requests the private sector made. There has to be a legitimate justification for that, be it because of a cost increase resulting from unforeseen circumstances or resulting from a discriminatory change of legislation or things of that nature that would have completely upset the economic balance of the contract. But it cannot be simply a means for instance, a contractor that had lowballed at the contract award stage and offered an unrealistically low price to get the contract, now tries to recover that through a contract adaptation later on. So the guide does advocate for flexibility, but also for some attention being paid and some caution in that, so that the fundamental balance of the contract as originally conceived is not upset. Now, it's to my deep regret that I must call this panel to an end. We have already exceeded the time allocated to us by our host by 5 minutes. I hope the participants found this as enlightening as I myself found, and that they will share me in thanking the three presenters, Shaina, Fred, and Marc, for their wonderful presentations. Thank you all very much for your attention and hope to see you again soon.